I didn't think much of the job listing at first. It showed up between a warehouse inventory gig and something about remote data labeling. Same layout as everything else on that board. Company name, short description, pay range that felt just high enough to get your attention without looking fake. Remote monitoring specialist, contract, flexible hours, high pay. I hovered over it with my thumb resting against the side of my phone, reading through it a second time. My kitchen was quiet except for the fridge humming behind me and the cheap wall clock I'd never replaced after moving in. Coffee had gone cold on the counter. I hadn't touched it in a while. The site was one I'd used before. One of those boards where half the listings feel like scams, until one actually turns into something real. You learn to skim fast. You learn to ignore anything that pushes urgency too hard or asks for upfront payment. This one didn't do either. The company name was what caught me. Ashen Blade Industries. I sat there a second longer than I meant to, trying to place where I'd heard it. Something vague. A late-night thread, probably. One of those discussions that starts with procurement contracts and turns into speculation halfway down the page. People talking about companies that don't advertise much, that land contracts without press releases, that show up in public filings without much attached to them. The kind of company that exists just outside of the part of the record that most people think to check. The listing stayed vague. No real description beyond observation-based work requiring strict adherence to procedural guidelines. No degree required. No experience necessary. Which usually meant something tedious or something weird. And I tapped apply before I'd fully decided which one I was hoping for. 2 days later, I got an email. It came through early, before I was fully awake, buzzing the phone hard enough against the nightstand to rattle the loose charging cable. Sender? ABI Recruitment. I sat up and opened it, squinting at the brightness. No interview, no video call, just a document packet and a contact name. Daniel Klein. I read the first attachment while sitting on the edge of my bed. The screen turned down just enough that it didn't feel like it was burning into my eyes. The onboarding was clean in a way that made me read it twice. Every page lined up. No typos, no filler. Just straight instructions without any corporate softening around them. The documents describe my role in plain terms. I'd be monitoring a live video feed from a secure location. Observation and logging anomalies. There was a strict confidentiality section, NDA language familiar enough that I moved through it without lingering, and a scheduling page covering 8-hour shifts with flexible start times inside a set window. The last page had Daniel Klein's name again. Same font, same spacing, and one short line beneath it. If you have questions, direct them through this channel. No phone number, just the email. I closed the document and sat there with the phone in my hand. The apartment felt smaller than usual. I noticed things I usually didn't. The paint near the window starting to peel at one edge. The faint detergent smell from the laundry basket in the corner. I replied with a simple confirmation, and 10 minutes later got a response. Equipment shipment confirmed. Estimated delivery? Tomorrow. I sent one more email before I put the phone down. Quick question. Is there a training period, or do I go straight into live monitoring? The reply came back in 4 minutes. You will be trained by the work itself. This is standard for your role. I read that twice. Set the phone face down on the nightstand and stared at the ceiling for a while. The box arrived the next morning. 2 quick knocks against the door, and by the time I pulled it open, The delivery guy was already halfway down the hall, already moving on to the next apartment on the floor. Small box, plain cardboard, no branding on the outside. It had a little weight to it. I set it on the kitchen counter, grabbed a knife from the drawer, and cut through the tape. Inside was a matte black laptop. No logo, no stickers, just a smooth surface that caught the light in a dull, even way. I lifted it out and pushed the box aside. There was nothing else in there. No charger, no paperwork, no note. I turned it over in my hands, checking the ports. Standard layout, nothing modified that I could tell. I set it on the kitchen table and sat down in front of it and opened it. The screen came up immediately, like it had been waiting. No startup sequence, no loading bar, just a black screen that shifted into a single interface with one program already installed. Monitor 7. No desktop icons, no browser, no settings panel I could find anywhere. I moved the cursor around to see if anything else would appear, and nothing did. So I opened it. The screen split into 4 feeds, each one snapping into place without delay. Different angles of the same location. A long hallway with concrete walls and fluorescent lighting overhead. The kind that hums in a way you stop noticing until you focus on it. At the far end, a single door with a number stenciled onto it. Room 14. The digits looked slightly uneven, like they'd been painted on by hand rather than printed. A metal chair sat about halfway down the hallway, frame bolted to the floor. The bolts were visible in the feed if you looked closely. The chair was empty. I leaned in a little. The resolution was sharp enough to make out small imperfections. Scratches on the floor, a faint discoloration running along the base of the far wall, a dark mark near the lower hinge of the door that might have been a scuff or might have been something older. A notification appeared in the corner. Session active. It blinked once, then held. Another followed. Please review operational guidelines. A document opened automatically, overlaying parts of the feed without fully blocking them. I stood there and read it through once, then pulled out a chair, sat down, and read it again, slower. Rule number 1. Remain at your station for the duration of your assigned shift. Breaks must be taken before or after monitoring hours. Rule number 2. Do not attempt to access any external applications while Monitor 7 is active. Rule number 3. If the chair in the hallway is observed to be facing a different direction than at session start, log the time and continue monitoring. Rule 4. If the door to room 14 is open, do not focus on the interior. Redirect attention to another camera feed immediately. Rule number 5. If any figure is observed seated in the chair, do not acknowledge it in your logs. Continue recording environmental details only. Rule number 6. If the lights in the hallway begin to flicker in a consistent pattern, end the session using the termination command provided. Rule number 7. If the lights go out completely, do not end the session. Rule number 8. If you notice movement that cannot be attributed to a person or mechanical source, log it once. Do not describe it further. Rule number 9. At the end of your shift, close Monitor 7 before standing up. Rule 10. If you fail to follow any of the above rules, document the deviation honestly in your end-of-session report. At the bottom, one final line. Compliance ensures clarity. I sat with my elbows on the table and fingers loosely interlocked, looking at the screen light reflecting off the surface. The phrasing sat in my head in a specific way. It didn't try to scare you, and it didn't try to explain itself. Just laid the instructions down and moved on. The way you write something you've had reason to refine over time. The way you write something when you figure out the hard way what happens when you don't. I emailed Daniel Klein before starting my first shift. Rule 5 says not to acknowledge a figure in my logs if one appears. Does that mean I should act as though I don't see it? Or does it mean the figure's presence is already accounted for and doesn't need documenting? I waited 20 minutes. Nothing came back. I made a fresh cup of coffee, drank half of it, and started my first shift that night. I set up before I began. Water on the table, phone on silent. Chair moved until it sat square with the screen. It felt like a stupid thing to be careful about, but I didn't want to start off already careless about something small. The hallway didn't change much for the first few hours. I found myself noticing the fluorescent hum after a while. Not as sound exactly, more as a constant underneath everything else. The concrete walls had an uneven texture, like they'd been poured in sections and never smoothed out between them. I logged what I was supposed to. Lighting stable. No movement. Chair centered. And typed each line carefully, glancing back at the feeds between entries. Around hour 3, the chair had turned. I leaned forward, trying to see if I was misreading the angle. It wasn't a large shift, maybe 15 degrees left. Just enough that the front of it no longer aligned with the hallway the way it had been. I checked the timestamp and wrote it down. 03:12. Chair orientation shifted slightly left. I sat back and watched it for a few extra seconds to see if it would move again. It didn't. At hour 5, the door at the far end of the hallway opened. It eased open slowly enough that I almost missed it. Just a thin line of darkness where the frame had been solid before. I caught it at the edge of my attention, and my gaze moved toward it before I thought about it, staying on the center feed a second too long before I registered what I was doing. I switched to a side angle. The door was still visible in the frame, but the interior stayed out of view, and I fixed my attention on the wall beside it instead. The texture of the concrete, the way the fluorescent light hit the surface unevenly. I logged the event without going further. 05:07. Room 14 door observed open. The pull toward the center feed built steadily after that. Every time my eyes drifted, I caught them and moved them somewhere else, and the effort of it left a specific kind of tiredness behind the eyes that had nothing to do with the hour. At hour 6, the chair wasn't empty. I noticed it in the peripheral of the feed first. A shape in the seat where there hadn't been one before. I didn't look straight at it right away, something making me take an extra beat. And then I did look, and there was something sitting there. I couldn't make out detail at that resolution, and there was no zoom function. So, I kept my eyes moving between the feeds the way I'd been doing all night, and wrote down the environment. 06:22. Lighting stable. No audible disturbances. I followed Rule 5. Still, it was right there in my sightline whenever I came back to that feed. Whatever was in the chair sat in a way that felt placed, centered, settled, like it had always been a part of the room, if you didn't think too carefully about when it had arrived. At hour 7, the light started flickering, and there was a pattern to it. On, off, pause, on. The rhythm of it hit my chest before I'd consciously connected it to the rule, and I checked the document to confirm. Then put my hand on the keyboard. Control plus Shift plus End. The feeds locked in place for a moment, then went black. I sat in the dark reflection of the monitor, with my own face faintly visible in it, the room behind me looking dimmer in the glass than it actually was, and I waited. Nothing happened. I finished the report, closed the program before standing, and went to bed. The reply from Daniel Klein was waiting in my inbox when I woke up. Your first session has been reviewed. Compliance noted. Continue as scheduled. There was an attachment. A still image of the hallway. Timestamp during my session. The chair was empty. I checked the timestamp. 6:22. The exact time I'd logged the environment while the figure was seated there. I leaned closer to the screen, like getting another inch would change what I was seeing. Then, I noticed something else. In the image, the chair was facing forward, perfectly centered. During my session, it had been turned left since hour 3. I went back to the rules and read them again, sitting there with my coffee going cold for the second morning in a row. Then I replied to Daniel Klein. The image you sent shows the chair empty at 6:22. During the session, I observed a figure in the chair at that timestamp. The image also shows the chair centered and forward-facing, but it had been turned left since hour 3. Can you explain the discrepancy? The reply came back in 6 minutes. The image reflects what was recorded. Your observation during the session is noted and consistent with expected parameters. Continue as scheduled. I sat there looking at that for a while. The reply acknowledged what I'd seen, and then closed the door on it in the same sentence. I was already aware that this was the kind of job where asking the wrong questions out loud was probably its own kind of deviation. I closed the email and pulled up the rules again, and read Rule 10 3 more times. The second shift, I sat down earlier than I needed to, adjusting the chair, lining things up. I'd made a sandwich before starting and then didn't eat it, just left it on the counter and kept checking the time until the window opened. I was more aware of my breathing than usual, and I couldn't stop noticing it, which made it worse. Hour 2, the chair shifted right. I caught it somewhere between positions. Gradual and then suddenly already done. I logged it. Hour 4, the door opened. I switched feeds faster this time without letting my eyes settle on the interior. Logged it. At hour 6, the chair was occupied again. Same position, same shape. I couldn't quite resolve into anything at that distance. I kept my focus on the far wall and the door and the lighting overhead, and kept writing. 06:18, minor flicker in overhead lighting. That was true. There had been a brief flicker, and then the lights had steadied. And it hadn't matched the pattern in Rule 6, so I hadn't ended the session. The figure stayed in the chair long enough that I started picking up details this time. The way it sat without shifting its weight, without any of the small adjustments a person makes without thinking about them. My eyes kept finding it, and I kept pulling them away. At hour 7, the lights went out completely. The feeds stayed active. The cameras were still running, but there was nothing for them to show. Just the hallway in full dark. The image giving back something dim and unreliable that my eyes kept trying to make sense of. I felt my shoulders pull up as I leaned toward the screen. Rule 7 already settled in my chest before I had consciously thought about it. Do not end the session. I watched the dark for what felt like a long time. Shapes started to separate out of it in a way I didn't fully trust, and somewhere in the feed, the figure in the chair was still there. I could tell by the shape of it against the slightly less dark wall behind it. And then it moved. Stood up, unhurried. I sat with my chest tight and my breath held, and I didn't log it. Didn't describe it. Just stayed with it until the lights came back on. The chair was empty. The door to room 14 was closed. The hallway looked exactly like it had at session start. I ended the shift, closed the program. When I stood up, my legs felt off in the way they do after you've been still longer than you realized. The morning email had an attachment, a still image, timestamped 6:18. The chair was occupied, clear. A figure with its head tilted slightly down and its hands resting on its knees. Defined enough that I found myself looking for a face before I caught myself doing it. I scrolled down. A second image. Same timestamp. The chair empty. Perfectly centered. Facing forward. Second session reviewed. Minor deviation noted. I replied immediately. I didn't acknowledge the figure. I followed Rule 5 exactly. What was the deviation? This reply took longer. 11 minutes. Rule 10 requires honest documentation of all deviations. You observed a figure and recorded only environmental details without noting that a deviation from standard logging had occurred. The deviation is not what you saw. The deviation is that you did not document. I read that 3 times. There was a difference in there that I'd missed, and once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Rule 5 told me not to acknowledge the figure in my logs, and Rule 10 told me to document any deviation from the rules honestly. Following Rule 5 was itself a deviation from standard logging practice, which meant Rule 10 required me to note that I'd done it. The rules weren't contradictory. They were layered, and I'd only been reading one layer. I sent back one line. Understood. Daniel Klein replied in under a minute. Good. Continue as scheduled. The third shift opened with a message on the screen. Adjusted guidelines in effect. The rules appeared again. All 10 of them. Same wording. Nothing changed. I read through them with my coffee going cold beside me. Both hands wrapped around the mug anyway because the kitchen was cold and I hadn't turned the heat up. I understood something I hadn't caught before. The rules weren't designed to prevent anything from happening. They were designed to keep what I observed consistent with what got recorded. The chair moving, the door opening, the figure appearing. Those things were going to happen regardless. They were already happening. Had been happening since before I started the job and would keep happening after. The rules were about my relationship to them. What I looked at, what I logged, when I stayed and when I stopped. The rules were less about the hallway and more about the person watching it. Clarity. The word from the bottom of the page. I was starting to understand what it meant, and I wasn't sure the understanding was making me feel better. The session ran close to normal for the first 5 hours. Chair rotation at hour 3. Logged. Door at hour 5. Switched feeds. Logged. At hour 6, the chair was occupied, and I wrote down the lighting and the door position and the wall texture, and at the end of my session notes, I added one line. Deviation. Did not acknowledge seated figure per Rule 5. Documenting per Rule 10. I sent the report and went to bed. No email in the morning. No message or anything from Daniel Klein. I opened the laptop and started the program, and the feeds came up. And the chair was already occupied at the start of the session. Before the door had opened, before the lights had done anything, before any of the other markers that had preceded it in the previous sessions. It hadn't been like that before. I sat there looking at it. The figure was more defined than it had been. Not in a way I could have pointed to a specific change. Just more present. The way a shape becomes clear the longer your eyes have had time to sit with it. I waited for the guidelines notification. It didn't come. No session prompt, no rules document overlaying the feeds. Just the 4 angles and the hallway, and the figure already in the chair from the moment the program opened. I emailed Daniel Klein while the session was active, which I was fairly sure violated Rule 2, in spirit if not in letter. The figure is in the chair from session start. There's no guideline prompt. Is this normal for the adjusted protocol? I watched the feeds while I waited. The figure didn't move. After about 8 minutes, my phone buzzed with a forwarded notification. Daniel Klein had replied to my email, but the reply had gone to a different address than the one I'd used. I only caught it because my phone had both accounts linked. The reply read, "This account is no longer monitored. If you are currently in session, remain at your station." I looked at that for a long time. Then I looked at the feeds. The figure in the chair had tilted its head slightly, the way someone does when they're listening to something at a distance. After a few minutes, it stood up, turned toward the camera. I understood something about the work that the onboarding documents hadn't included, and that Daniel Klein's careful emails had never said directly. The monitoring had never been one-directional. I'd been looking at the hallway, and something in the hallway had been accumulating information about me. My response times, what I logged, what I avoided, where my attention went when I was trying to keep it somewhere else. Every session had data moving in both directions, and I'd only been aware of one of them. A message appeared on the screen. Session active. Then, clarity lost. I pressed Control plus Shift plus End. The screen held. I tried it twice more and the feed stayed on, and the figure in the hallway kept walking towards the camera with the same unhurried pace it had used to get out of the chair. Arms at its sides, head angled slightly down. I stood up without closing the program. Rule number 9. I knew it as soon as I did it. The laptop screen flickered. For a second, the reflection in it showed my room. The edge of the table, the chair I just pushed back, the kitchen behind me with its overhead light casting a dull glow across the counter. I stood there looking at it, and then I saw something else in the glass. The hallway, behind me. Too long, too narrow. The concrete walls from the feeds extending out past where my wall should have been. Sitting wrong in the angle of the reflection. I didn't turn around. The fluorescent hum came through the laptop speakers, though there had never been audio before. Low and constant, and close enough that it stopped feeling like it was coming from the device. Something shifted behind me. I could hear it in the pressure of the air, the way a room changes when the balance of it is different than it was a moment ago. I stood facing the screen. The figure on it kept walking, closing the distance to the camera one step at a time. And in the laptop's reflection, I could see the same movement behind me. The same pace, the edge of it just visible in the corner of the glass. The chair scraped softly across the floor at my back. A real sound. Close. Physical. The metal chair in the hallway on the screen. My chair. The one I'd been sitting in for 4 sessions. The one I'd moved to sit square with the screen on the very first night, because I hadn't wanted to start off careless about something so small. I stood facing the screen and made myself think through what I knew. The rules existed. The rules had been refined over time by someone who understood what happened when they weren't followed. Daniel Klein had reviewed my sessions, had sent corrections, had answered emails at odd hours, with a precision that suggested the work mattered to someone further up than a contract recruitment coordinator. There was a structure here that predated me, and would continue after me, and the structure had a logic to it, even if I didn't have the full shape of it yet. Clarity lost. That was the message, which meant clarity had existed before it was lost, which meant the rules had been maintaining something I'd been benefiting from without understanding it, and I'd broken Rule 9, and whatever the rules had been keeping in its proper relationship to me was now in a different one. The figure on the screen was close to the camera now, close enough that the feed showed the top of its head and its shoulders and the way it moved. Still unhurried, still deliberate, with the specific quality of something that has no reason to rush because it already knows where it's going. Behind me, the chair had stopped scraping. I reached for the keyboard without turning around. My hands found the keys by feel, the same slight resistance I'd noticed on the first night, and I typed the one thing I hadn't tried yet. Not the termination command, just a text field that had appeared in the lower left corner of the interface sometime in the last few minutes without any prompt. I typed, "What is Rule 11? The feeds cut out. All 4 of them, simultaneously, replaced by a single centered line of text on a black screen. Rule 11. If you reach this point, you already know you cannot follow it." The screen went dark. The apartment was quiet in the way it had been on that first night before I'd opened the box. The fridge running, the clock ticking, nothing else. I stood there for a long time with my hands on the keyboard before I finally turned around. My chair was pushed back from the table at an angle, the way I'd left it when I stood up. The kitchen behind it was empty. The hallway to my bedroom was empty. The apartment was exactly what it had always been. Same walls, same furniture, same peeling paint at the window edge I'd been meaning to fix since I moved in. Everything was where it had always been. I checked my email. One new message. Sender, ABI recruitment. No subject line. The body of the email was a single sentence. Your contract has been fulfilled. The equipment will be collected tomorrow. I replied before I could think too carefully about whether I should. What was I monitoring? The automated response came back in seconds. This account is no longer monitored. I looked at that for a long time. Then I looked at the laptop. Still open on the table. Screen dark. Just a black surface catching the kitchen light. The box it had arrived in was still in the corner where I'd left it. Plain cardboard. No branding. I picked it up and turned it over in my hands, checking the inside the way I should have checked it the first morning, running my fingers along the bottom, the corners, the seams. In the bottom right corner, under the cardboard flap, something had been written in pen. small, neat. The kind of handwriting that belongs to someone who writes carefully because they know what they're writing down matters. They don't watch the hallway. Do not apply for this position again. Below that, a name. It wasn't Daniel Klein. A different name. Someone who had held this contract before me and had left this note in the box afterward, either as a warning or as the only record they could make without it being logged. I set the box down on the counter and stood there looking at it. Tomorrow, someone would knock twice and be gone before I reached the door, and the laptop would disappear into a vehicle I wouldn't see, and that would be the end of it as far as ABI was concerned. Might have a direct deposit and a set of rules I now understood, and a name in ballpoint pen in the bottom corner of a cardboard box. I stood there with the box in my hands and thought about the person who'd written it. They'd held this same contract, sat in front of the same 4 feeds, watched the same chair turn, followed the same rules until they understood them well enough to leave something behind in the one place that wouldn't get logged. They'd done all of that and then gone quiet 14 months ago, and I didn't know yet whether quiet meant safe. I took a photo of the note before I went to bed, because I'd spent 4 nights learning what it cost to let something go unrecorded, and I wasn't going to start now. I lay in bed with the phone on the nightstand, a photo saved, charger plugged in, a clock ticking in the kitchen the way it always did. The apartment was quiet, the fridge hummed, everything exactly where it belonged. I stared at the ceiling for a long time before I slept. In the morning, the laptop was gone. I hadn't heard anyone come in. I checked the front door first. Locked, chain still on, the way I'd left it. Back door the same. No windows open. No sign of anyone in the apartment. Just the table where the laptop had been. The ring of condensation from my water glass still on the surface. My note still sitting beside it. The box was gone too. I stood in the empty kitchen in my socks on the cold floor tiles and looked at the empty table for a long time. The clock ticked. The fridge ran. Outside, someone on the floor above me was moving furniture. Slow scraping sounds that traveled down through the ceiling at irregular intervals. I picked up my phone and opened my email, and found the ABI recruitment thread and hit reply. The equipment is gone. I didn't let anyone in. How did you collect it? I waited. The automated response came back in under a minute. This account is no longer monitored. I stood there in the kitchen with my phone in my hand and the photo of the note still in my camera roll. They don't watch the hallway. The hallway watches the monitor. Do not apply for this position again. And the name underneath it that I hadn't recognized yet, but had written down on the back of a receipt I'd found in my junk drawer before I went to bed. I looked up the name. I was still in my socks, still standing at the kitchen counter, and I didn't move for most of it. The search kept pulling up nothing, and then something small, and then nothing again. I found a profile that had gone quiet 14 months ago. Last post, a generic industry share. The kind of thing people schedule in advance and then forget about. Below that, buried in an older thread about contract work in the private sector, a username that matched something I'd seen in the note's handwriting. The way certain letters sat, the particular spacing. It took me a while to find the post itself. I was sitting on the kitchen floor by then, back against the cabinet under the sink. Phone screen the only light because I hadn't thought to turn the overhead back on. The post was 11 lines in a forum I recognized. Same corner of the internet where I'd first seen Ashen Blade Industries mentioned in passing, in a thread that had since been deleted. The writing had the same quality as the note in the box. Careful. Nothing wasted. If you've worked Monitor 7 and you're reading this, the contract is already done. Don't try to contact ABI directly. Don't search the location. The only thing that matters now is whether you followed Rule 9 on your last session. I read it sitting on the cold floor tiles with the cabinet handle pressing into my shoulder and the fridge running 2 feet from my head. I read it until the words stopped moving around on me. Then, I checked the timestamp. 14 months ago. The profile had gone quiet 2 months after that. I got up off the floor eventually. Made tea I didn't drink. Sat at the table and looked at the condensation ring and my own handwriting on the piece of paper with the name on it. And I thought about Rule 9 for a long time. Close Monitor 7 before standing up. I hadn't. Hey everybody, hope you enjoyed today's story. This one was written by Justice Figueroa, also known as Pentyworth223 on Reddit. Justice has a bunch of books out. You can check them out over on Amazon. I'll include a link in the description below for that. You can also find them on Reddit. And they have a new podcast, actually, which is airing on YouTube. It's called the BTA Podcast. I actually recently appeared there as a guest. It's mostly just like a loose discussion podcast talking about all things horror, movies, books, creepypasta. We talked a little bit about the Backrooms movie when I talked to them over there, as well as about video games, a bunch of other stuff. I'll include a link to that in the description below as well, or search BTA Podcast on YouTube. This story I'd probably include in the existential dread sort of category of horror, where the protagonist himself is part of the horror and kind of creates the horror in his own mind and with his own actions. The book House of Leaves is a great example of existential horror. If you haven't read that, highly recommend it. A few other really good existential horror novels, if you're interested in that sort of thing. Tender is the Flesh, Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut. He leans more on the kind of satire comedy side, but that one classified by some people as a existential horror. Also, The Deep by Nick Cutter. Highly recommend Nick Cutter, especially his other novel, The Troop, is also really good. Also kind of fits into this existential dread category. If you had to pick one of them, I would say read House of Leaves. Fantastic book and just really, really solid existential horror novel. I've done a little bit of those types of stories myself as well, but those books I mentioned, they do it the best of anybody, in my opinion. There's a bunch of other ones as well, which I haven't read, but I'm looking to get to at some point. This story, obviously, about a kind of a security type person who watches a live feed. I've done my fair share of this, watching a live feed while working at the old mental hospital back in the day. A lot of my shifts, I was working in this kind of little tiny booth on the second floor, where I'd watch people come and go out of this maximum security unit, and there were 5 magnetically sealed doors locking the way through to this high security wing at the mental hospital, and each one had to be closed for the next one to open. So if you read my book Beneath the Asylum, you might remember I mentioned that a little bit, and a lot of that was inspired by real life. How a lot of the time the staff would be rushing out to a code white for a violent patient, and they'd forget to close the last door behind them, or wouldn't quite latch properly, and then they'd be looking up at the camera, yelling at me to open up the door, and getting upset, sometimes getting mad at me for not opening the door, but, you know, not really my fault. The one before it has to close first, so, yeah, it's a little bit of a stressful job at times, but, yeah, I still get nightmares that I'm back in that room, back working at that hospital sometimes. It's a little claustrophobic at times, but yeah, if you've read my book, Beneath the Asylum, you probably get the picture I'm talking about here. That particular job, watching video feeds, watching live feeds as a security guard, can get very boring, and your eyes get strained, and kind of want to do anything else to pass the time. Where I worked, somebody had hidden a folder with episodes of The Office deep in the hard drive of the computer there. So we'd kind of throw on The Office in the background while we were sitting there, opening up the doors and watching the cameras. Lots of respect for the character in the story, for actually watching the camera feeds. That's easier said than done. I've got a bunch of exciting stuff coming up on the channel soon. There's a new Hollow's End story I've just finished writing. Just went through a second round of edits on it yesterday, so I'm hoping that one should be going up on Monday. I'm going to go through it a couple more times and just make it as good as possible before I post that. I've also very fortunately been getting sent a lot of stories from old writer friends who have featured on the channel before. Some have taken a little hiatus from writing. Others are busy doing commissions and things like that. But yeah, a few different writers actually have recently reached out and sent me some stories. Some are on the shorter side, so you might see some, sub 30-minute stories coming on the channel, but they're going to be really good. And then there's also one that's over 2 hours long, maybe 2.5 hours, which should be really, really excellent. I'm really excited to share that one and to share all of those stories with you guys. Hopefully you'll enjoy all of them as much as I've been enjoying reading them. Hope you're all enjoying the summer, making the most of it. For those of you who have nice warm weather where you are, I actually got out to the beach the other day, which was really nice. Kind of burnt to shit now, but it was a really fun day. It was nice to drive down to the beach and have a day out there. It's like an hour and a half to get down there from where I am, but it was a nice day. Let me know down in the comments what you're getting up to this summer. If you're getting out to the beach or getting camping, or what you're up to, going to theme parks, or what you're doing, going on vacation somewhere. Always love hearing from you guys down in the comments. All right, that's about it for today. I'll quit yapping at you, and I'll be back on Friday with a new story for you guys. Hopefully you're having a great week, and yeah, I'll see you on Friday.